Okay, hello, welcome everybody. This is definitely not your technical deep dive talk, so if you're here for the tech stuff, maybe go to the other room. This is actually like a recap of the history of cloud native, as brief as I could fit in 30 minutes. I tried to give this talk with a more extended time period, which worked out terribly since it took me about close to 2 hours, so I had to cut it down quite drastically. Anyway, my name is Daniel. If you want to have any further details, please chat with me afterwards, since we're quite short on time. Now, the big question I wanted to answer for myself, and maybe also give you a little insight, is how did we actually get here, especially tech-wise? And while having a look at that, what did you actually listen to get some reference for what the times were, history of cloud native? Talking about brief histories, other people had the same idea. If you want to know the brief history of time, humankind, our species, there are some pretty good books about that. If you want to know about cloud native, stick with me. As I said, I tried to give this talk in a more extended time frame, starting from 1911 when IBM was founded, since we all know this is the beginning of IT, which it pretty much is, back to 2005 when Git was established. And since this is actually quite a time frame with lots of stuff happening, I wanted to track this down drastically, so I'm trying to fit in 100 years of IT history in about 4 minutes. So let's see how this goes. Well, as I said, everything started with IBM, since they were the company that pretty much developed all these mechanical, electromechanical computers, the mainframes, and then processed from there and introduced IT to a broader audience. In 1948-49, after the Second World War, we then had Kanban invented as the Toyota production system at Toyota to streamline the manufacturing of hardware good cars in that sense. And that's also quite interesting about 100 years later when we have Kanban in IT. Then in 1952, we had the first compiler developed by Grace Murray Hopper, who was one of the bright minds of IT history. And she was also the first person to lead the development team, not of Fortran, but of COBOL. So Grace Murray Hopper, one of the very important people in IT history, writing the first compiler. Fortran was developed by IBM in the 50s. And in the late 50s, only 7 years after we got the first compiler, we already got COBOL, which, as you all know, is still a state-of-the-art programming language, at least according to the finance industry. Then in 1969, Ken Thompson developed Unix at the AT&T Bell Labs. Keep in mind the Bell Labs, since they are fundamental for the IT development as we know it. Interesting here, 3 years later, Dennis Ritchie developed the programming language C. So we actually had Unix before we had C. And then he and Ken Thompson re-implemented the existing software and the existing code of Unix written in C. In the same year, we got the first real virtual machine, production grade, mainframe-based IBM virtual machines in the technical sense as we know it today. So this was not experimental, but this was already GA back in the day. Quite fascinating, to be honest. Then 1975, in April, 2 people founded Microsoft. Who founded Microsoft? Yes, exactly. Paul Allen and Mr. Gates. Exactly 1 year after that, Apple was founded, so it's actually the 4th of April and the 1st of April, so really just 1 year apart, Microsoft and Apple, close competitors. Steve, and the third guy that nobody remembers to this day, since he sold his stock like 2 or 3 weeks after they founded Apple. Probably a bad marketing, a bad investment decision. Then in the early 1970s to the early 1980s, TCP/IP was developed. Initially as a research project by the US military and by the Stanford University. They tried to implement it as one protocol, then had to split it up into 2 protocols. In 1983, there was the go-live day for TCP/IP on the ARPANET. This is pretty much how we got the network-level foundation of the internet as we know it. Back in the day, only for universities and for military bases. Then also in the late 70s, we got the 8086 processor, still famous to this day, Intel processor with the process instruction set that is still used till this day. Not in 8-bit or 16-bit anymore, but in 64-bit. But still, same instruction set, still relevant to this point in time. Then already in the 80s, and that's quite interesting, we already got NFS by Sun Microsystems in the 80s, which is going to be interesting since you will see that iSCSI, block level storage protocol, was only developed in the 2000s. So we had file storage over the network already 15 years prior. Then we had the first draft of Scrum, not with an IT focus, but rather with a product development focus as a whole. A few years after that, Fiber Channel was already developed, ratified by ANSI in 1994. And in 1991, we got one of the big milestones in IT and also in cloud native history, the development of the Linux kernel. By whom? Yes, Linus Torvalds, exactly. All right. After that, 1991, we had one very, very, very important guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who pretty much, be honest, he founded the internet. He developed HTTP, HTML, the first web browser, the first HTTPD web server, which was then adopted by Apache to be the HTTPD as we know it of today. And he pretty much founded the internet that way. He and a co-worker of his at CERN, so at the European Nuclear Research Facility. What do you think what the name of the first web browser actually was? Any guesses? You all know it, but you don't know it. It's called the World Wide Web. Fun fact. All right. After that, in 1994, only 3 years after we got the internet, at Stanford, we already had the first online banking. Fun fact here, only 1 year after, we got SSL. So Stanford is pretty much always bleeding edge when it comes to IT technology and to moving the boundaries of what is technically possible, probably a little too further in that regard. 1995, we had eBay. 1995, we also had Scrum as we know it, the Scrum manifest, and the Scrum development methodology. And that's also quite interesting. Scrum was here before we actually had the HL manifesto. In 1995, Sun Microsystems also released Java. And this pretty much brings us to one of the important things for cloud native, the founding of Google. Not because I'm a Google fanboy, but because Google developed Kubernetes, and that's what we're working with today. 1 year after that, we had Salesforce, which is also important for the technology and industry as we know it as of today, because Salesforce was the first company to promote software as a service. They didn't sell products, they sold a service via a website, as a customer relationship management system, which was revolutionary at the time, since this was even before the year 2000, and we already had the first SaaS service, even before AWS. Then, as I said, iSCSI was developed in 2000, and in 2000 we also had the dot-com bubble. Then most of the startups pretty much went down, except the big ones that still survived to this day, and they thrived afterwards. Pretty influential, as we know. In 2001, VMware then published the first x86-based server hypervisor, which was pretty much the rise of commercial virtual machines as we know them today. And in 2001, the HL Manifesto was published. Fun fact here, do you know where the HL Manifesto was written? It was actually written by a bunch of developers and program managers and product owners in a ski resort in Utah. They met for a stayover for a whole extended weekend, gathered, had a workshop, and developed the HL Manifesto in one weekend. And this is pretty much how we got to Git. Git is quite interesting. It's also developed by Linus Torvalds, not because he actually wanted to, because he had to. Because the Linux kernel management or development team back in the day, they actually used a proprietary source code management system, which they had free licenses for, and which was actually quite cool. Technically speaking, pretty similar to what Git is today, until the day they revoked their free community licenses for the Linux kernel development team. And Linus Torvalds was pissed. He then wrote an email to his colleagues. He said, well, I'm going to be off for 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, Git 1.0. 1 year after that, AWS was launched. And they actually launched with 3 services that still exist to this day. EC2, so virtual machines, not with this technical implementation anymore, but still SQS and the S3. So also the S3 storage protocol, at least the ancestors of what we have today, were already published almost 20 years ago. Then we had the team around Avi Kiviti, which is an Israel programmer, who actually developed the KVM, kernel-based virtual machine module for the Linux kernel, which makes Linux a hypervisor. I think some of you guys were at the talk before by Rainer Kugler, by the talk where we discovered Kubernetes, which is a KVM QEMU-based hypervisor. The interesting part here is that the company that developed this whole thing was founded in 2005. They developed it, they got it merged to the kernel, approved by Linus, and then sold the whole company 3 years later for $107 million to Red Hat. It's pretty good revenue for 3 years of work. And it's still striving until this day. Then 1 year later, we got the Linux kernel feature, Linux kernel 2.6.25 that actually introduced the last relevant group of namespaces and the C group feature, which is the technological foundation for what we need for the container technology as we have it today. So already back in 2008, we would have been technically able to run container workloads in pretty much a way that we have them today. And we were also listening to Coldplay back in the day. It's at least some gigs. All right, 2008, GitHub was founded. I'm not going to tell you about GitHub or the people that founded it, but does anybody know Scott Chacon? No hands? All right. The interesting thing here is that he's actually doing another thing, which is called Git Butler, small startup in Berlin, doesn't matter at all. But we met this guy at the We Developers Conference 2 years ago, and he's an amazing bloke. He's a really cool dude. He already handed out margaritas at 9 a.m. at the tech conference. Definitely recommend him. Then 1 year later, Google released the Go programming language. And this is actually a milestone for cloud native as we know it today, because pretty much all of the server-side and CLI-based tools that we have today are written in Go. Kubernetes, Docker, you name it. 95% of everything that's on the CNCF landscape is written in Go, and is coming back to this release of 2009. Who do you think was involved in the development of Go? Since this is actually a pretty solid piece of engineering. Yes. Ken Thompson, the creator of Unix, was one of the head developers of Go as well. And so was Rob Pike, who was also a member of the AT&T Bell Labs team, of the Unix team. Both of them are also responsible for the development of UTF-8. So actually pretty solid knowledge there. And we've talked about Bell Labs for quite some time. I just want to give you one interesting piece of knowledge here. Did you know that Bell Labs is actually responsible for for 10 Nobel Prizes, multiple Turing Awards, until they moved from AT&T to Nokia? So they're still in existence, and they had their prime time when they were with AT&T, but since they moved to Nokia, pretty much nothing happened anymore. But still, 10 Nobel Prizes is not bad for one research facility. Then in 2010, we had this sir, Mr. Anders Heilsberg, who was developing TypeScript at Microsoft. Are there any C# developers, .NET developers out there? Yes, I see some hands over there. You should also know Anders, because he was also the head developer for C# and for the .NET framework. So this is also one of the brightest minds in IT industry when it comes to developing program languages. TypeScript was then released in 2012 and is also pretty much here to stay. Then in 2010, we had the launch of Azure. I'm not going to go into any details, but if you want to know how a launch at Microsoft used to look like, just scan these QR codes and give it a giggle. Then in 2010, and this is actually quite an important year as you see, because there are more entries in 2010, we also had RISC-V. RISC-V is a reduced instruction set processor developed by the University of Berkeley in California. Does anybody have a guess why it's called RISC-V? It's actually as stupid as it sounds, because it was the 5th attempt at such an architecture. And it's still going strong today. So RISC-V is actually quite successful. Since 2015, there is a RISC-V Foundation, because pretty much every successful open source project needs to have a foundation some point in the life. And this foundation, sooner or later, will then get merged to a Linux Foundation, but more onto that later. And we already had the first big hardware vendors back in 2020 and 2022 adopt RISC-V for their hardware. Not server-grade hardware like CPUs, but for example storage chips with Western Digital. And in 2022 there was already the first consumer notebook available by a Chinese company called Deep Computing. So this is actually also a project that's going to stay with us for quite some time and gains traction. So we don't only have ARM and x86, but RISC-V is also out there and still growing. Then in the same year, NASA and Rackspace launched OpenStack. Who of you is familiar with OpenStack? I expected more. Okay, OpenStack is actually kind of the technological basis on how to build your own cloud infrastructure, pretty much in a nutshell. The interesting thing here is in 2010 it was developed, in 2012 the OpenStack Foundation was established, as again, every successful piece of software and every successful open source project needs a foundation. NASA pretty much quit at 2012 when they said they don't want to invest their engineering power and their knowledge and their money for corporations and businesses to just take their money and make money out of it. So they actually quit contributing to OpenStack, which is quite a rare thing, to be honest. The OpenStack Foundation was then renamed to the OpenInfra Foundation in 2020, and in 2025, maybe some of you heard, was merged to the Linux Foundation. So operating system and the whole cloud on-premise part are now merged together under one foundation. Then 3 years after that, Docker had its big release, its big coming out. Docker was actually the company, and we already heard in 2008 we had the technological basis to run containers, but Docker was the first company to provide the wrapper code around it. Back in the day, actually written in Python. It was just a low-level Python CLI tool to run containers as we know it today. Only 1 year later, they rewrote the whole thing in Go, founded actually a legal entity, so Docker Inc. was founded 1 year after that, and then the famous rise of Docker actually started. The founder then left the company, and since 2021, Solomon Hykes is working for Dagger or with Dagger.io. Maybe some of you are familiar with that CI/CD focused build framework. And then in 2014, Eminem and Rihanna released the Monster, and Google released Kubernetes. Thank you for the giggles. So this is actually pretty much the most iconic release date that we know of in the cloud native space since this day, since this was pretty much the whole thing that kicked off our industry as a whole. Kubernetes still is the operating system and the technical foundation for what we have in the cloud native space today. We had clouds before, but everything was done individually. We had, for example, OpenShift before, but there was a different orchestrator underneath. But since Kubernetes, all the orchestration, the container management technologies were merged into this one product. And since it's only a very, very sophisticated API server, which is very flexible, new things started to evolve and being built on top of that. That's why Kubernetes is still going strong as of this day. Of course, it's production ready, and it's so flexible that pretty much everything that an application needs can be built on top of Kubernetes. And we did. Just check the recent numbers of the CNCF projects. I think we exceeded 200 this year. So there's actually a lot going on, tooling and industry that's built on top of Kubernetes. Same year, we already had some talks about that today as well. eBPF was integrated into the Linux kernel, the extended Berkeley packet filter, which actually has nothing to do with the Berkeley packet filter at all, except the notation. The origins of BPF were actually developed in the early 19s, but this was only focused on network filtering, network packages. eBPF as a whole, as we know it today, being able to integrate it into kernel events, file system related, network related, process related, you name it, was actually developed in 2014 and is going strong since this day. And this is only growing faster and faster. This is one of the, I don't want to say hype topic, but fast rising stars of the infrastructure as we know it today. 1 year after Kubernetes was released, Google and the Linux Foundation then established the CNCF, the core foundation for communities that host events such as ours. and that maintain pretty much all of the available open source cloud native projects till this day. Pretty much every company in the IT space is somehow affiliated either with the CNCF directly or as an end customer, but this is pretty much what we're working with in the whole IT space today. And in the same year, we already had the first KubeCon. The fun thing is, I did a similar talk before, and I showed the establishment of ticket prices for festivals, which actually grew by 250% since 2005. Ticket prices for the KubeCons actually didn't rise this much for the past 10 years, so it was already expensive back in the day. All right, then also in 2015, the Mozilla Foundation released Rust. Rust is actually quite interesting because some people are still afraid because it's a complicated, statically linked language, yada yada. But actually it's the most admired programming language on Stack Overflow service for almost 10 years now. Since 2016, developers love Rust. The Mozilla Foundation is actually the foundation that is governing the development of Rust, but this was already going on as a side hustle by one guy since 2009. Mozilla Foundation then started to support it, published the first version in 2010, first preview version, and in 2015 we got the first V1 version. Rust is pretty much the go-to solution for everything that has to be fast and usually is, should be run as a CLI tool. But also other tools, for example, such as Linkerd, the proxy in the Linkerd service mesh is also written in Rust. So this is definitely also an enterprise-grade programming language. All right, 1 year after that, in 2017, Google, IBM, and Lyft introduced Istio. Who knows Lyft? Apart from Envoy, who knows Lyft for what they actually do? Photo. That's the biggest competitor to Uber in the United States. In Cloud Native, they developed the Envoy proxy, which is still the most important component of many of the service mesh products out there. It's a proxy, reverse proxy written in C++. And Istio is by far the most prominent service mesh out there. Then in 2019, pretty much platform engineering and this whole hype around cloud native organizations was kicked off when Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais published Team Topologies. I can highly recommend this book. Have a look at it. There's actually a V2 version released this year, so definitely check this out. Then in 2019, we got OpenTelemetry, when Open Tracing and Open Sensors merged to a unified protocol. I'm not going to go into any details since we already had talks regarding that, and this will save me some time, so I'm glad for that. But 2019 is pretty much the year when OpenTelemetry under unified umbrella was released, and since then most of the observability vendors are jumping on this bandwagon here. Anybody heard about SolarWinds? If not, you should have. It's the most important hack pretty much in security history, the most critical software supply chain security hack. When a software vendor was hacked that was delivering management software and updates to pretty much all of the important US government institutions and universities, and most of them got pawned hard. So if you think about Singularity and Shai Hulud, what was going on like 3 weeks ago, this time 10 times more important and 10 times more critical. In 2021, apparently Microsoft released Windows 11, which had lots of improved features. And 1 year after that, we had the first meetup of CNCF chapter in Graz. This is not only important because I did it, but because it was one of the founding stones of the KCD Austria event and the Cloud Native Days Austria that we're here for. Because Graz is actually one of the 4 big chapters in Austria apart from Vienna, Linz and Innsbruck, and is also one of the biggest contributing volunteer bodies, let's put it that way, for the KCDs, and big parts of our teams are also contributing to the Cloud Native Days that we had today. That's why this is important. And we're still going strong. We have meetups every month, so if you're ever in Graz, make sure to stop by. 2023 then was the big rush of platform engineering when it really took off. Any DevOps or SRE engineers such as myself in the audience? Yes, 1, 2, 3. If you want to increase your salary, rename to platform engineering. 15% more out of the box. Don't tell your boss. These are official statistics, by the way. Then in 2023, we had the big acquisition of VMware by Broadcom. Anybody still troubling with VMware? Yeah. You don't want to raise your hand, I see. This is actually one big part of my job, consulting companies of what to do now. Either it's expensive or we don't get a license anymore. Anyway, 2023 was the year that Meta actually released Ollama, which made AI as we know it, LLMs, usable from like consumer-grade notebooks and actually easy to play around with. I put this in like the poster child for AI. I'm definitely not an AI advocate. It's cool, you should use it, but I'm not the person to lecture about that. So this is everything you're going to hear about AI from my side. But what's way more important, in 2023, we actually had the first KCD Austria event here. So this is our third installment. We started in 2023. And big parts of the teams are still with us, which is actually great from my point of view. In the same year, we then founded Cloud Native Austria to actually be independent from each and every vendor. We created an association. So we are actually able to host such big events and to also foster the community by getting money, raising funds, and putting it back to the community to fund local meetups, to fund educational purposes. So we are actually trying to actively give back to the community in Austria. And this is pretty much how we got here in a nutshell at the Cloud Native Days Austria 2025. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you for being ahead of time. Big shout out again to Graz, right? Also the other cities, but if you happen to be in Graz, and also if you want to present, not only in Graz, but anywhere in the world, CFPs are open. Any questions? We have 1 minute time for questions. There's a question here.
What's next? Wait 1 second short. What's next? I didn't. The audience. So what's next? You showed a timeline with a lot of pioneering software and tools.
2026. Tech-wise, I don't know. I just know community-wise, we're definitely trying to grow the Austrian community. We're talking about chapters in Villach, maybe revitalize Salzburg a little bit. So we definitely want to do something there. Tech-wise, if I know, I'd be rich. I wouldn't tell you.